So yeah, let me start sharing my screen here. Okay, make sure I do the right one. That'd be a great way to start. Okay. All right, we should be seeing that first title slide, testing for non-testers. Hope we're good. I'm gonna get going. So yes, I am Christina Adams. I work for Site Improve. I am a digital accessibility engineer, software engineer, however you want to say it. I totally made up that title. However, I've been working in the kind of web design user experience space for 12 plus years now. And it's only in the last maybe 4.5 that I've specialized in accessibility and web accessibility in particular. So I am not a tester. I will start off the session by saying this. I am a designer, a user experience person, a developer primarily. So I very much rely on our actual certified testing team to help me out with full accessibility audits. So I just want to start off by saying that you do not have to be an expert in testing specifically when we are talking about accessibility or being web accessible. And I wanted to share some techniques that I use when I'm asked to do some reviews as a non-tester, as more of that technical implementation person. So I hope that's interesting. I ordered these in a way that is hopefully kind of going from easiest to maybe the most complex. And again, they really require no training at all. These techniques are kind of a way to start and set yourself up for success when you go into a full audit. And again, these are not things that would take the place of actually using users with disabilities and assistive tech users in your process. So don't think this is going to solve every problem out there. This is a way to set yourself up for success going into that type of testing and hopefully lowering those occurrences of issues. Okay, so let's start off, if I'm on the right screen here, with talking about sensory bias. This is something that I think every single role, from content writers to developers like myself, can have an impact here in searching for these things and removing them or remediating them far before they become an issue or published into whatever digital product you are making. I should also say I am going to be focusing on web techniques here. There's probably a whole other presentation we could do on mobile or any others type of things, and these are things that are free and don't require training. So hopefully, I forgot to say that in the first slide, but these sensory bias things really come into play with all of our roles across that development life cycle, right, from content editors up. And I think it's a place we can definitely make some improvements very quickly. So what do I mean when I say sensory bias, right? That includes things like using color alone, or other sensory related language or processes, implementations, right? So this first one here, a question you could ask yourself within your process, either through your creation process or through kind of your audit, user acceptance test, whatever that process might be, is color alone conveying meaning? And this is one of the very easy things to catch right off the bat. And something that I run into a lot when I'm asked to do these kind of quick reviews of a site or something that's going to go into production, I will look for this one almost immediately. This is probably the first thing I'm looking for, is there anything on this screen where we are using color alone to convey some sort of meaning or some sort of information that has no text or no other way of delivering that information. In all those cases, we must include something else in addition to that color so that people who do not perceive color, for instance, can get that information. And we're conveying that in multiple different ways to multiple types of users, right? It's actually just a better design technique overall. So this is something we can look for very quickly, even at our wireframe stage, to see if we have these sorts of issues, and maybe go back through a design phase to think about how we might include a text addition to that or convey that in a different way. The images on my slide here that convey this sort of thing that we're looking for is the first one is a first name input field with a red box around, or a red border around the field where you type in the first name in a form. And I'm assuming some sort of validation might have happened here. And we have a big red border telling us that there's an error, at least telling those of us who can perceive the color red that there is an error here. This is, again, we're conveying that meaning only through color. And that's something we're going to have to make an addition to convey the information that this is the field that has an error in it back to the user. And again, that's probably not just going to help people that do not perceive the color red. It's probably going to help a lot of people who just don't understand what that means, right? Let's make that more clear. Let's add something to it. Next to that, we have kind of this panel of report results, and it's kind of displayed in a table format. We have reports and report name links and created with dates underneath that, and then a column of status, which just has a circle. And the first one is a color red and the second one is color green. No additional text there. Again, if we cannot perceive that color, we're not getting that information to a lot of our users. And again, it just might be confusing if you don't have something like a legend or something to display what those colors mean, especially if they're branded colors. That's going to be really difficult for a lot of users to understand what we're talking about there, what we're trying to convey to them. So again, is color alone conveying meaning? In this case, yes, this is something I would flag in that sort of quick review report to indicate we need to maybe rethink that or go back and redesign that. And then the classic one below on the left of the screen here is I have just lorem ipsum text with blue. Every so often there's a blue word that is highlighted or a word that is displayed in blue color with nothing additional to that. I would I would assume that these are links within that paragraph of text, but there's nothing to tell me that other than the color blue. This is again a place where we're telling you that the user that this is an interactive element, and that interactive but we're only telling the user that this is an interactive element because of the color blue. There's nothing else to tell anybody that this is clickable, that this is an interactive element. Can't say that word today, but so we'll need to add something else to that. Traditionally, that'd be an underline, something like that, to distinguish that link from the surrounding text in addition to using color. Okay. And this is a kind of a level A sort of WCAG standard. This is something in that perceivable bucket when we're talking about WCAG standards. I will mention those throughout these, but I will tell you that I don't usually focus when I'm doing these sort of quick reviews of sites. I won't worry about the WCAG guidelines. I know that's maybe blasphemous as an accessibility specialist, but I'm much more concerned about the user experience when I'm looking at this. I will sometimes then relate it back to WCAG standards for that, legal foundation, compliance, conformance foundation. But I'm more concerned about how users use the product. So I'll put an asterisk on that as we go through this. Continuing with this sensory characteristic, sensory bias. This is something that I have unfortunately, a lot of experience with trying to convince people that this is not a good practice. So on the screen here, I just have text, and it says another question you might ask yourself within this process of, are these descriptions, are there descriptions that explain sensory characteristics, right? So some examples of that might be click the green button, or the text on the right, or the task in red status, right? All of these things relate to a color or a perception of left and right, or, you know, there's lots of different examples I could put up here. But before I worked at Sight Improve, I worked in higher education, and it was like really old school content development, e-learning approach to stuff. And I had to do full-on sessions with some of our writers to get them out of this habit of saying some sort of sensory characteristic, because these don't matter if I can't perceive the color green, for instance, in the example of click the green button. The text on the right, well, if I'm using some other sort of formatting within my system, whatever that might be, maybe I'm not referencing the actual visuals, that presentation layer of our site. Right, left, up, down maybe matters, but left and right don't matter in that sense of things, and actually could be just very wrong, or not in the order that my tools are reorganizing that content with. So again, something to keep in mind, get yourself out of the habit of these sensory words within your copy, right? Within your writing in your content, because they can be really difficult to understand. And this is, again, maybe not a roadblock for users. It's just not a good experience for users to have. And it's just one of those more inclusive design processes we should be implementing within all of the steps of our process. So again, these are things that I would probably write up in that quick review as things to change, but it might be a little less concerning than some of the other major errors of like links missing text or things like that, which would actually be a huge barrier for folks. So there's levels of severity here, certainly, and you and your business will have to decide where that line is, for instance. But if I'm the consultant, I will still report this as something that needs to be changed. Right, moving on to everybody's favorite topic of color contrast. This is definitely probably the most common issue we come across in general. A lot of brands don't have accessible color palettes. A lot of people don't have the rules in place within their style guides to apply those colors correctly, or in a way that is accessible or inclusive. So this does come up a lot. And I get the question a lot, how can we get ahead of those sorts of errors so they don't show up across our full site, especially in an automated checking tool or something of that nature. So some of the techniques I'll cover here just are tricks that I do when I'm going to test some stuff. If you have an automated tool that's going to spit those out for you, that's ideal, I think, but because you'll get that full system approach to things. But if you're in the design process and you just need to check stuff, that's where some of these techniques do come through. So just starting off, I did want to mention the WCAG color contrast levels, because there is quite a lot of confusion around them, I think. So whenever I deliver one of these reports, I always get follow-up questions about, you know, what does this mean for the end user, right? Where are we in the compliance or conformance talk track? So the level AA standard in WCAG is 4.5 to 1 color contrast ratio, and that's text versus background. So that's really what we're focused in, is just any visible text versus the background. And then large text is 3 to 1 ratio. Level AA also has a non-text contrast ratio of 3 to 1, and that's adjacent colors. And this would be things like really important graphics, like if you have a check mark that conveys meaning, or a button, an interactive element, that border or that button color versus background color, you would want to reach this level of contrast, right? And then the AAA version is 7:1 text versus background, and a large text of 4.5:1, right? And so this is very confusing right off the bat. So I'm going to tell you, just know your goalposts for some of these things. That's where these automated tools really help you in defining this, because finding the luminosity and the color contrast between two colors at 4.5:1 ratio, right? That's not like a human calculable thing. We're not expecting you to do that in your head, right? So use your tools. And some of the tools that I use when I'm spot checking like designs or wireframes is, I know it was mentioned already, but we have the WebAIM color contrast checker. It's great. I love it. And it also has an API. So if there's any developers on the call, you don't even have to open up your browser. You can just write a little API call and get your answers for if you're meeting that color contrast ratio, and it will spit it out. You put your foreground color in, your background color in, and it will do all that calculation for you, right? So it'll tell you that the WCAG AA normal text standard passes in this instance, where we have put in a blue color, mid blue color versus a white background. It does tell you the contrast ratio of 5.35:1 in this case. And then, so WCAG AA passes normal text. WCAG AAA fails. My large text passes in both double and AAA. And then those graphical object user interface components, which is that non-text contrast, at AA passes as well. So pretty good color. If we're going for AAA, we might want to make that blue a little darker. But this will just spit that answer out for you, so you can spot check your site or your design. And this is something I do all the time. I usually have that API up in the background for myself to work with when something looks a little suspicious that it does not have enough color contrast in it. All right, another trick you could do in this case of color contrast, if you want to dive into the dev tools in Chrome, for instance. I prefer Chrome, but I do know that Firefox has very similar tool sets for analyzing this. But we can assess the color contrast just within the DevTools module. So if you're already in here, for instance, this is a good little check to do within as you're building something, if you're building a prototype, perhaps. But on the screen, we can see that the website above has a "How can we help" button in blue with white text. I have DevTools open in dark mode here. Developer, sorry. And then I have that button, which is a link, actually, it highlighted in the DevTools HTML view. And then over in that right panel of DevTools, I have the styles panel open, which shows us our CSS. And what I've done is I've clicked on that color property inside that panel, which gives you a little square. And I clicked on that square, and it actually brings up this color palette, essentially. Within that, if I am on something that has text versus a background color, it will actually tell me the contrast ratio of that between the color, which refers to the text color, versus whatever it can assess as the background. So there's still room for failure here, but this is kind of handy if you are in the HTML to open that up, and it will tell you if it passes the AA 4.5 or the AAA of 7.0 here as well. You can also play with the sliders if you did need to pick a slightly darker color or different color in general. It can do that. You can play around with that and see what will pass too within this. So very handy. I use this a lot when I'm especially developing interfaces or anything of that nature. This really helps to have this right here to help. And I should have mentioned too, that color code is called a hexadecimal number, and that's usually what we're using. But in the case that you're using something else, RGBA, or any of the other ways you can format color, within the dev tools, you can actually, there's an arrow up and down right next to each other, next to that hex field. if you click on that, it can cycle through some of the other, that same color, but other ways to code that color. So however you feel comfortable, it's kind of cool to use. And so that might not be very apparent if you're not a developer and you're not in dev tools every day. This might be something very useful that turns out to be very useful. But for those users who are like, that's way too much for me, which I understand completely. Another tool I use very frequently and there's plenty of them out there, but I use Chrome extensions, browser extensions. Again, all the other browsers also have an extensions manager of some sort where you can install these extensions. But essentially just up in the main bar of Chrome, I now have this eyedropper icon, and this one happens to be Colorzilla Chrome browser extension that I use a lot. It's free. When I click that eyedropper, it brings me a panel down and I can pick a color from the page. And it also gives me a lot of other options. I get a color history, palette browsers, gradient generators. So it's kind of useful in a lot of different ways. But if I'm like, well, I don't really want to go and look at HTML or CSS, I don't understand it, that's totally fine. You can use this extension to pick a color from the page and then go paste that color into something like the WebAIM contrast checker. And that's something that I do frequently, especially when I need a quick answer. This also very much helps for things like images. If you have images that might have too low of contrast, you can spot check the image with this color picker and put it into something that will do the math for you for that contrast ratio. All right. So I'm going to move on, going a little too slow, so I'm going to pick it up a little bit. The next thing we can do is keyboard focus. Everybody can do this. We all have keyboards very likely, or the majority of us that have a keyboard that we can test with. So another question we might ask is, can I reach all the interactive elements using keyboard tab key, right? So put your mouse away. Can I navigate everything in the site? Can I hit the tab button and go to everything that I know is clickable on this page? A really easy test. Everybody can do this, and it will give you a lot of information. You can also start testing those other functionality, right? Can I click that link with the enter key, right? How can I use this form with my keyboard with arrow keys, for instance, certain form elements? You can start really getting an idea of how non-mouse users would interact with the page. And this is, again, no mouse challenge. There's a whole thing on it. A lot of people do it for GAD events, so I highly recommend giving it a shot. It's a good way of experiencing how accessible your site is for keyboard users and any technology that uses keyboard as its primary way of accessing the content. As you're doing that, you can ask yourself the question, is there visible indication of where I am focused on the page? That's that. In most sites, it's like a blue or white or dotted line around whatever interactive element you're currently on. That's extremely important to a lot of users who are referencing the visuals, but using their keyboards. The best thing you can do as developers and designers is leave that to the user agent in general. So that's if I'm writing up this report on a quick analysis of a site, this is almost always my recommendation, right? Leave it to the user agent, because if you are leaving it to the user agent, it's kind of out of your hands, right? That user can then customize their browser or use the right browser that they like the best. So it's kind of it maybe feels like a loophole, but it's actually a really great experience to leave it to the technology that's, serving up that content to do what it does with it, because users can customize it. And that's, again, this is a level AA requirement, so everybody's got to do this if you're reaching that AA standard for legal reasons. So again, this is often forgotten about, doesn't come up until the very end for a full audit. We really need to address that sooner in the process. So looking at this, how are we going to style it? Are we going to leave it to the browser? All things you could do in your design process. Right, building on this, we also have focus order. So as you're doing your no mouse challenge, with whatever it is you're trying to assess quickly. Is what I'm finding logical? Is it matching how it's represented visually on the screen? These are all things that we need to consider. If it's jumping around, users who are zoomed into the interface at a high level, like 400%, that's going to be very jarring for them. It's not going to go left to right or top to bottom like we would expect. We're going to lose ourselves within the page, right? So questions to ask yourself again are, what's the expected order for keyboard focus, and is it following that? Up on the screen, we have this form. It looks like the two first fields are side by side with each other. They're in kind of a darker background area. And then below them, we have 4 additional fields in 2 columns in a white background. So it seems like 2 separate interactions here. This could be interpreted in many different ways. What's the logical focus order? Should I go from the first 2 fields and then down through the columns or something? So logic to me might not be logic to everybody. So this is something we will definitely have to agree on sometime before this gets to our final audit, because there's just a lot of ways to interpret this, especially when we're talking about columns. And these are highly interactive elements, right? We're asking our users to do something within them. So we really want to make sure we get it right. And I should have said there's a button for recalculate in the 3rd column. So even more complicated. We have 3 columns to go across with information. So a diagram for this focus order can maintain that consistency through all of your processes. But we definitely want to share that with whoever's doing that testing, right? We want to verify if this makes sense, logical sense, if we're following a pattern that's expected, if the user is getting that information in a way that's meaningful, right? So we have the same form, but we have an arrow going from the first 2 fields in that dark background, then down to that top right or top left column, and then over to the next, and then down again to column 1, and then over to the next column, and then the recalculate button. So that's one pattern, right, where we're going across from left to right and then dropping down. We could also do this in a different way, right? Same form, we have the first 2 fields, arrow going between the top 2 fields, dropping down to the first column in the next section, and then down the column before we go up to the 2nd column and down the column and then over to the button again. So this is an opposite pattern, same form field. You could argue that both of these are logical in some way. It depends on how maybe you want your user going through it, right? So that expectation being set early is something we want to communicate across our teams and think about it before we hand that design to a developer and they're just going to develop it how they think it might be logical or how easy it is to style it, right? So again, something we can definitely improve upon. I see this as a very confusing aspect. We've had full hour-long meetings talking about focus order with people I've done consulting work with. So this deserves your attention within that kind of process of testing, even internally. Okay. Next topic is names and descriptions. This again is pretty easy, I think, for all of us to do, especially if you are the one responsible for writing said names and descriptions or implementing them. This covers a lot of space, I think. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of important ones that I think apply to more roles. But you'll often hear in full audits, you'll hear something about accessible names, right? That's pretty confusing when we're talking about names and descriptions, right? Sometimes that might take the form of an accessible description or alternative text, right? But I personally like to stay away from alternative text because folks think about alt, which is just for images. I often say accessible names. So when we're looking at our designs, we will want to make sure that everything has either a native HTML content name. So in that first example, we have a native HTML button with submit your answers as text inside that HTML element. What I've done here is I've opened up Chrome DevTools again, and they have a accessibility panel that's built in. which does the calculation of that name for me. I don't have to decide what its name is by looking deep into the code. I can open up that accessibility panel and see under that computed properties accordion, we have the name of submit your answers, and how it got to that name is the contents. So the contents, submit your answers. It also gives us information about its role and stuff like that, which if you're doing a much deeper audit, that might be interesting for you to look at as well. But the accessibility panel can give you that information really quickly. So if I'm checking a button, like, oh man, what's the name of this button? We want to make sure it means something valuable to the user. You can open this panel and just make sure that it's named something useful and specific to whatever it is you're trying to communicate to the user there. Alternatively, that same button implemented in ARIA, you can see in this example, just for instance, because that button element does not have HTML text inside of it, but we've given ARIA label of submit your answers. This might be an icon button. The submit your answers gets populated up into the accessible name of that button in this case, in the same way that it did with the HTML button. So again, if you're looking at that icon button, you're not sure what its name is, you're not sure if that ARIA label is correct or not, open up this Chrome Tools accessibility panel, and you can see the name calculation there again. Name is submit your answers, and how it calculated that was ARIA label. Okay. Again, this is like a level A and AA criteria. This is essential to a user experience. So this is something that I definitely spend my time on before we go into like production with this site. Along those same lines, images. So images require alt text, especially if they are delivering meaningful content out to users. So a question you could ask is, do images and graphics have an accurate description? Automated tests can tell us if it has alt value or not, or if it's decorative, but it will not tell us if that description is good, right? Is human readable, for instance. So I like to use bookmarklets. I know they're pretty common out there, and there's a lot of them around, but I tend to use Paul J. Adams bookmarklets out there. They're really useful. Essentially what they do is do a little script, and you hit your bookmark, and it will run that script on whatever page you have open and pull out this, in this one in particular, the alt value and put it up on the screen, so you don't have to dig through the code to see what the description is. It's very useful if you have a page full of text or images and you want to make sure all of them have alt value that's meaningful. First image there, it's an image of a dog, and I've used the bookmarklet, and it comes up as a dog in a harness and a leash standing in the snow, right? That's pretty good. I'm going to okay that one. In the second image, I have an image of text, which we'd like to avoid, but in some cases we can't. I want to make sure that that alt value with the bookmarklet matches exactly the text within that image. And I can do that pretty quickly with this bookmarklet. So I definitely recommend that. You can write a little script, put it in a bookmark, and run it on the page whenever you want. All right. See, I'm doing okay. All right. And kind of the last topic here, this is probably the most technical, and we alluded to it a little bit with the accessible name, right? Is this accessibility tree concept? And if you're into it and you're doing a full audit, or not a full audit, you're doing one of these reviews and you're going deep into what that assistive tech user experience is going to be like without, you know, going as far as using the screen reader or using some other assistive tech on the site, where you just want to do this within maybe your development process, or you're not an expert with that, taking a look at what's being communicated in the accessibility tree will show you exactly what's communicated between the user agent, which is the browser, and the assistive technology through that accessibility API. All of the information we're sending about all of the pieces of content on the site get communicated through that out to assistive tech. So it's highly likely that if you're looking at the accessibility tree and that element makes sense, all the roles are included, all the accessible names are included, the assistive tech is going to parse that correctly, right? And go into the correct modes and things of that nature to deliver that to the end user. So I do end up here pretty frequently when I'm doing these quick reviews, especially for things like roles or really serious ARIA implementations. If we've done a very complex composite widget in ARIA, this comes in very handy. So for those of you who might be on the more technical side, I highly recommend doing this as well. So again, we alluded to this with the accessible name, but at its core, that accessibility tree is the DOM structure HTML, and we'll communicate the roles, states, and properties and accessible names through that API to assistive technology that will then deliver it to the user. So I have a photo of the very old Site Improve site homepage, and next to that, this is what the accessibility tree of that site looks like. And you can see that parent-child relationship where you have a nested structure like an outline that's actually generated by the structure of the HTML. So it's very similar. It's essentially giving a stripped down version of how our HTML is formatted. And then within that, the one that's highlighted here in the accessibility tree, we can see that we have a heading of Achieve Your Digital Potential. We have a paragraph, a link that says book time with us, book time to talk with us, a link that says get a free site audit, and then some other generic containers. But those are getting communicated with correct roles. Heading would be the role of that, and then Achieve Your Digital Potential is the name of that heading, the text that will be communicated to the user. So you can see how this might be really useful going into that sort of audit, and just making sure that things are going to assistive technology in an appropriate way, right? We're communicating all of the things, states, properties, names, roles out to whatever technology is going to parse this document as well. So all of that, very cool. It's really, really nice to do all of these things within your process. It's good, like for consultants like me who aren't testers, but would like to get some feedback back to a customer, for instance, who doesn't want to go through a full audit, doesn't have time, doesn't have the space runway for it, but would like to improve it before it gets to production. That's where these techniques come really into play for me, but they could come into your development lifecycle as well as something for internal review processes, code reviews, for instance. A lot of these are very useful in that sense. However, again, I need to mention it is not a replacement for a full manual audit. You still need people with disabilities and their technology to go through your site and actually give you feedback and tell you how that user experience is doing. So hopefully that's going to go smoother if you follow some of these tips and tricks. But again, we don't want to only rely on some of these little tricks, little testing techniques. We want a full system where we're actually including the users with the full user testing with users with disability and professionals who use assistive technologies. So that's all I had for slides. If there's questions, we can certainly take those now. Happy to.
Great.
I will stop showing my screen for now.
All right. Well, thanks for that session, Christina. Yeah, before we jump into the Q&A, we're going to put up a poll again. Please just fill this out. Helps us keep the lights on. We need it for some of our funding reporting, and it also enters you into the pool for some accessibility prizes that we'll be selecting winners and notifying within the next couple days. So yeah, with that, if anybody has any additional questions, please use the Q&A button to add those to the list, and we will start moving through these. All right. The first question is from Chris. He says that you've mentioned level AAA conformance quite a bit, but doesn't W3.org not recommend level AAA conformance be required as a general policy for training or training materials?
Yeah, I'm not sure on the specific wording there, but AAA is definitely, it's in the guidelines. It is based in user experience and perception. So it's still something maybe to consider, but it is definitely not a part of current legislation out there. I know that. I will say it's pretty rare to find folks who are going for that AAA conformance. But it's still, I guess, if you're looking at user experience, it can still give you very good information about certain standards or guidance for reaching more users in a more accurate and inclusive way. So I wouldn't discount it entirely, I guess, is the take home on that long answer, but I wouldn't discount it entirely. But I understand that it kind of drops off on the priority for training and implementations.
All right, next is a question from Angela. What is the format you've used to communicate agreed upon decisions of changes, expected changes, deliverables to content developers? For example, email, agency forms, Smartsheet, etc. I found that emails are a quick, hey, I would like, but a form is more specific, but contributes to additional time between parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I agree, email is definitely great for one-off things. It is not great for major structural change, right? Especially when we're talking about maybe a style guide or a pattern a library that we're trying to implement, things of that nature. Forms can work. I know I usually will write up kind of larger reports, usually in a Word format, for instance, highlighting issues with recommendations underneath them. I'm often at a higher detail place, though, where I'm giving specific implementation recommendations, including code examples. We've also communicated those changes through something like a code repository. I don't know if that's in scope, but if I have access to make an issue in their code repository, I can actually highlight the piece of code and comment on it and give specific advice, which is very useful in talking in that developer's language, certainly, and in the tool they're using. But I've also seen it just like a Excel spreadsheet, right? You got columns of issue, recommendations, impact, and then you can use that for further planning for like capacity planning and things like that. But it kind of depends, I guess, on what you're comfortable with and what systems you're working with in general. Hope that answers at least part of that.
All right. Next, we have a question from Chris. Do you use Andy, the DHS trusted tester tool, to test for accessibility rather than maybe the accessibility tree?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have used Andy. I like it very much. Trusted tester goes by slightly different standards, just very small differences between that and maybe the ACTR community group in the W3C, right? So you do have to know, maybe use that plus another checker to get kind of a more holistic view of that. But I do really like Andy a lot. And I know a bunch of the folks I work with who are more in the trusted tester program than I am, because again, not a tester, but they use that a lot and it's very helpful, pumps up really good information.
Yep. Next, we have a question from Weston. For images using alternative text, what's the general rule or any tips to keep the alt text crisp to accurately describe the graphic?
Yeah, I could do a whole session on that. Yes, generally, I would first look at, is there text, is that redundant information? Because if it's redundant information from the image to whatever the page content is, I may consider marking that as decorative. I wouldn't recommend that all the time, but definitely first question, is it redundant? Because I don't want someone to have to listen to the same thing twice, right? But then keeping that alternative text nice and crisp, I would say you want very few, if none, no images of text, because infographics that are built in JPEGs, right, and delivering lots of text content is going to be really difficult to make accessible in any way, right? So it kind of goes across roles here. We want to make sure design is on board as well. We want to deliver that information in maybe more concise ways. But also just watch out for words like picture of or image of, or things that kind of don't speak to the core of the meaning of the photo, right? Or the image that you're trying to describe. If it's not adding value, don't include it. That's usually the best. Don't write alternative text for alternative text's sake. Make sure you're conveying the meaning and only the meaning of whatever that image is delivering.
Yeah, great. That's a great recommendation. Next, we have an anonymous question. You mentioned the API from WebAIM. If we use the color contrast analyzer tool from TPGI, do we need to double check with the WebAIM's API, or does one color contrast tool plus some Axe automated checks, would that be sufficient?
Likely that'll be sufficient. The automated tool like Axe might have issues with certain elements on your page if they're positioned absolutely or fixed, right? We can't always know where the background color is. You might have to assist it a bit in those, and those are the things I would probably spot check with a color contrast analyzer tool. But you can prioritize those out. Do the automated check first, double check those answers, and then probably go into that spot check if you have the ability. The API and the WebAIM contrast checker and the other tools all go by the same calculations. So I think they're all pretty accurate, I'd say, across the board.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that algorithm is set by the WCAG standards, not necessarily by each individual tool, and so they're all kind of using the same thing.
Yeah, and you can go read the algorithm if you really want your head to spin a little bit. That's fine. You can do that.
Yeah, it's like this long. It's a pretty beefy calculation. But
it is.
Okay. Next, another question from anonymous. Do you have any recommendations for accessible design courses for designers and developers? Sometimes developers, are designers too, and they need more training on that side.
Ooh, yes, I agree with that statement for sure. I started as a designer and went into development, and I learned lessons that cross those boundaries often. So I definitely recommend kind of that more universal design approach to teaching that. I think designers can definitely benefit from things like the DOM and accessibility tree because they're primarily working with structure, for instance, and that can affect things like focused order down the road. So totally agree. I don't have any specific recommendations for specific courses, but anything that's including universal design or kind of that overarching bridge for that technical accessibility implementation trainings, those can be good. I don't want to plug us. I really don't, but Site Improve does have some courses. If you're a customer, email me. We can get you set up with that. I'm not a commercial. Sorry.
Well, it's for we're not a commercial either, but I guess I'll take this opportunity to plug us as well. We are currently developing some digital accessibility courses that will be available, soon, and we'll be putting the word out on all those when those are complete. So
awesome. Might have to come talk to you about that. I'm interested. Yeah, I'm interested.
Definitely. Okay. Looks like we just have one more question in the Q&A. We have, it looks like we just have 1 minute. So this is going to be perfect. So Anonymous asks, have you used the accessible color palette by GitHub? If you have, do you have any tips for using it?
That's a really great question. I didn't know that existed until very recently. I'm very excited about it, and I haven't had a chance to really play with it. But there are some really good web-based ones that do that as well, where they'll do, you'll pick a starting color or a couple colors and, get a palette essentially of tints and shades within that that are accessible. And I really like those tools, especially getting that concept across to folks who might be doing more brand development work, making design systems of that nature. I think that's really cool. And I don't have any specifics about the GitHub tool, but I'm going to dive in probably right after this session to see what I can learn about it. It looks really cool though. I'm very excited about it.
Great. Okay, I think that is gonna do it. There is another question in the chat, but I think we can answer that one offline. So,
Okay.
all right.